As I said, I'm Theo Sandvoort. I'm the director of the Development Core, organizer of this session together with the Statistics, Assessment and Data Management Core. This session is about stigma, and there is a growing awareness that stigma is intersectional. People are not just black or white, they're also female, male, or trans. They may be using drugs, they engage in sex with persons of their own sex, they might have mental health problems, and so on. So the stigma associated with these various identities and behaviors is not something that you just can add up. Intersection implies that one stigma qualifies the impact of other stigmas. And the question for researchers then becomes, what do you do? How to best assess intersectional stigma? About a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, we had a speaker at the Grand Rounds who told us that he was working on a solution. And I'm very pleased that I can introduce that speaker today. And he will share his experiences in assessing intersectional stigma. And that speaker is Seth Kalichman. He is professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at the University of Connecticut. He is trained as a clinical community psychologist. He is the director of the Southeast HIV/AIDS Research and Evaluation Project in Atlanta, Georgia. And I think most people will know that his research focuses on social and behavioral aspects of HIV infection, sexual health of gay and bisexual men, HIV treatment adherence, HIV stigma, and the intersection of HIV infection with alcohol and other drug abuse. Probably most famous as editor of AIDS and Behavior, editor-in-chief, and that's how most people will know you, Seth. We are very happy that you're here to share your experiences with us, Seth, and I hope we have a productive session.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Theo. Actually, I really appreciate that very much. People often misrepresent my background when they introduce me. That was enormously accurate, which is, I think, good. So thank you so much. I'm happy to be back. It would be wonderful to be there in person. I see that there are people joining that I haven't seen in a long time. So hopefully sometime very soon. I hope this doesn't count as an invitation to come back to the HIV Center. So this didn't count. So yeah, and a way I kind of view this today is picking as sort of a part 2 to the Grand Rounds that I did a year ago. So that's actually right on spot also, Theo. So to sort of pick up where I left off, I think, last time. So just to remind you, if you didn't see the Grand Rounds, to tell you that, HIV stigma is ubiquitous. It's widely studied. HIV is stigmatized on multiple dimensions and for multiple reasons. And so HIV stigma as a socially constructed phenomenon and its importance to every point along the HIV prevention and treatment cascades is well recognized. The way that I've sort of viewed this over my career is that the stigma literature was sort of, I used to say a mess. Now I really think of it as just a long period of formative kind of work. And I think about, 15 years ago or so, there were some, an influx of people studying HIV, specifically in HIV, studying stigma, who were real stigma experts. Before then, it was just people like me who would measure, put together a scale or use a scale and include it in our studies, but not really what you'd consider a serious stigma researcher. And stigma has been, an area of research in sociology and anthropology, in other fields, and to some degree in social psychology for a long time. And it was really when some sociologists and social psychologists became involved in HIV stigma that I think things started to get better. One of those people is Valerie Earnshaw. And so Valerie, what is elegant about Valerie's work is that she looked at the literature and pulled together the sort of common concepts and built a framework basically to pull all of this stuff that was out there together in a meaningful sort of way. And in so doing, created some scales that have turned out to be useful. And so her early work was really geared towards those two things, making sense out of what we know and developing some instruments that might be useful. And so Valerie, what's elegant about the work isn't so much that it's novel. A lot of people say, well, we've kind of had these concepts of internalized, anticipated, and active stigma for a long time. And that's true, but it wasn't really articulated in the field of HIV quite so clearly before Valerie's work. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. And so my conceptualization around HIV stigma really is geared to this framework that we can think about the negative attitudes towards HIV and people living with HIV and people at risk for HIV in these constructs of how the beliefs become internalized within the person. People experience discrimination and stereotyping and stigma experiences. Those are enacted. And people can anticipate that in the future, because of their HIV, they're likely to experience these stigma events, and that's anticipated stigma. And they map on really nicely to behaviors that are relevant to treatment and prevention. So that's kind of where I left off. That was sort of a synopsis of part of the stigma here, stigma there, grand rounds. But I mentioned in internalized stigma, and I did say that we had recently been funded to develop a new scale, which it turns out not to be a scale, but turns out to be an approach to measuring internalized stigma. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So there are several scales that are available, like I mentioned, and we had to develop these items for use in South Africa a long time ago. That's what I'm saying is, if you want to call me a stigma researcher, because I pulled some items from Berger and used them in South Africa and kind of reframed them. I don't think I was back then. But it was a scale and was useful, and it seemed to predict some things. And Valerie's scale is much more comprehensive, and she, of course, encompasses the notion of internalized stigma, which is very similar to stigma shame and other constructs. There's a lot of things like this. But we have found Valerie's scale is useful. These are items from her internalized stigma scale. Having HIV makes me feel like a bad person, those kinds of internalizations of HIV stigma. And then she has enacted stigma. Have you been treated badly, unfairly, stereotyped? People expect you to be a certain way because you are living with HIV. So all of these items are framed around because of your HIV status, and that's what makes it HIV stigma. And do you anticipate in the future that you would experience these bad things because of your HIV status? So sort of a clue to where I'm going here is you could look at these items and change the because of to many different stigmatized characteristics of individuals. How likely is it that people will treat you in the following ways in the future because of your sexual orientation, because of your race, because of your being a woman, because of your being a New Yorker, whatever, it doesn't matter. You can put any identity, social psychologists like to call it, any attribute is what I call it, in that instead of HIV. That's kind of a clue, but HIV stigma scales key the items to HIV. And there are other scales that assess other stigmatized characteristics and attributes, like substance use stigma. And those measures can be framed in the HIV stigma framework to be now what Valerie really is seeing as a stigma framework. And so the concepts of internalized, anticipated, and enacted stigma equally apply and psychometrically seem to work well. But the thing is, we know that stigma dimensions are not independent in the sense of the self. So people with HIV may identify themselves as, I am a person with HIV, but they are more than that. And so the notion of measuring self and identity is a very big topic. It occupied, Freud's life. And so this is, where philosophy and psychology sort of meet in personality and the self. And so this is a very big topic. So we just sort of have to use a legal term, stipulate that HIV status is an element of some people's identity and self, but it isn't their be all and end all of themselves. For some people, it's a major part. So the activist and the advocate and the person who wakes up in the morning thinking about HIV and goes to bed at night thinking about HIV and their role in it, it's a more salient part of their identity. So this is a topic that I'm not well equipped to talk about. I know a little bit about the personality and social psychology, but I wouldn't want to go there. This is not my purpose. My purpose is not to re-theorize intersectionality. My purpose is to try to figure out how to measure it. So there are measures of these concepts. Now you'll have to forgive me. There are some typos in the slides. It's the first time I've actually talked about this measurement of stigma thing, and you'll have to forgive me because there's a typo in some of the slides. So there are several conceptual frameworks for intersectionality, many that extend beyond HIV for sure, and stigma as well. But I'm going to be very myopic about this and try to understand measurement of intersectional stigma. And there, people who are important in the field of HIV stigma have talked about this, like Barbara Berger. Here's how Barbara Berger sort of defined intersectional stigma as, and the key terms for me here, this really stood out to me, the interlocking forms of oppression, which can be identified as separate singular systems, but whose explanatory power is greatly enhanced when they are seen as interactive and interdependent on each other. So when you have like HIV stigma and sexism or racism, and they become intertwined, that's the intersection. They become joined where they intersect. Now, most influential in this world of intersectionality really is Kimberly Crenshaw, and she's very interesting. She's a feminist theorist, really, and she wrote a paper that was published actually in an ethics and law kind of a journal, where she talked extensively about intersectional sexism and racism in the lives of Black women and Black sexual minority women. And her concepts are very rich. And I think that her writing on intersectionality has been most influential. And she talks about these axes of oppression and these axes of domination. So there's like this concept here of these intersecting dimensions, or these axes that come together. And so I don't want to say that this is heavily influenced where we're going with our measurement, but upon reflection, we're very consistent with these concepts. So this idea of intersectionality, of these dimensions that meet, is very appealing to me in thinking about measuring intersectionality. And this is a representation of sort of Crenshaw's thinking in an image, you could say, where there are two dimensions, really, domination and privilege to oppression, and these different types of discrimination and oppressive attitudes, and I think stigma meet, and they meet, but do they intersect? And so I totally get it. I think it's very useful, and the multitude of the different dimensions that meet in an individual's phenomenological experience is sort of the concept that's really important here. And it still begs the question, how do you measure it? And so there are fewer instruments for measuring intersectional stigma. There's a bit of research in the HIV field around intersectionality and the experience of intersectionality from a phenomenological perspective, qualitative interviews with individuals about their experiences. And that is very rich, but it's not a measurement strategy. So there are some people there's some things, and they are not bad things. It's not that they are not good. It's not like they need to be replaced. It's just that it's a very limited toolbox. So one approach is to assess independent stigma dimensions, like HIV stigma and let's say substance use stigma, to measure that in people who are HIV positive and have a substance use history or substance using, for example. So you can measure those two dimensions independently. This is an approach that Valerie Earnshaw has taken with some of her colleagues. This is really not a psychometric approach. This is a statistical approach, because what they do is they have these two independent measures, HIV stigma, substance use stigma, could be any two. And then in a regression model, look at the interaction of those scales, the interaction of those terms, and define that as intersectional. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that. It's just that it's like the qualitative work, it's nothing wrong with that, but it's not a psychometric approach. It's a statistical approach, which is fine, but it's not a scale. It's not an approach to measurement. It's really a statistical strategy. Another approach is to write scales with items that combine attributes. So you can have items that say, think about these experiences as a Black man who has sex with men, or as a Black woman, or as a woman living with HIV. And in the item, you have the intersection of these two things. It's where we're asking people to think and reflect on their experience as a person with those two of their many attributes. And so, this is an approach that was taken here. And so you can see in the instructions for the measurement, the investigators say, based on being a woman of your racial ethnic background. That's where the intersection happens. And it's probably the most common approach to trying to measure intersectional stigma. The downside of it is, in this study, what these guys did was they had 3 scales for this sort of measurement development and to look at this specific concept that they were interested in, this gendered racism. They had a scale of sexism and a scale of racism, and then they had their scale of gendered racism. And what they were able to show is that the intersectional scale predicted their outcome, whereas the independent measures, these are separate, and unidimensional measures did not. And so it's a very common approach to measuring intersectionality, and I think intersectional stigma, and I think it's fine. what leaves me a little unsettled is you don't really know how salient in any given stigma experience. This is not a big deal, but you do kind of wonder if someone's experiences are more about them being a woman and the sexism she encounters, or her being Black and the racism she encounters. And where those two meet isn't necessarily equal, and every item is treated equal, and there's nothing wrong with this, but I think it's probably been a good approach. Another thing that people have done, I've seen, this is the only study that I've seen that did this, and I liked it. I think it's interesting. They sort of combined the qualitative and the quantitative approaches of trying to get at intersectionality. They asked people, sexual minority, African-American sexual minorities, to monitor their experiences over the course of a 24-hour period, and then pick one where they, and describe it in 5 sentences, where they had some negative experience that was related in some way to being both Black and LGBTQ. So in thinking about your day-to-day experience over the past 24 hours, can you describe where you had a negative encounter or a negative experience of some kind because of your being both? So that's the language of intersectionality. You're being both. And again, this could be, you could do this with a, where you had a negative experience because of your race and sexual orientation, like this, or your race and HIV status. And, the stemming is of the attributes can be changed. And then they had them characterize that intersectional experience by checking off whether or not that experience reflected these aspects of their community and their social relationships. So it's an interesting approach. Closer to where we went is a scale that looks at how negative experiences can be ascribed to intersecting attributes. Now, I found this to be quite interesting. In an enacted scale, what they did was they said, their instructions were to think about experiences related to who you are. This includes both how you describe yourself and how others may describe you. For example, your skin color or ancestry, your nationality, your religion, your gender, your sexuality, your age, your weight, your disability or mental health issues, and in your income. And then they had them thinking about who you, just because of like who you are, because of who you are, have you experienced these negative stigmatized experiences? And they did this with anticipated stigma too. Because of who you are, do you think in the future people will treat you this way because of who you are? Then after they answered all these questions, they said, now, who are you? And what were you thinking of in terms of the attributes of yourself when you answered our questions? So the intersectionality scale, this intersectionality scale measures intersectionality as a construct, irregardless of race, sexism, but it can look back and say, look, let's take a look only at people who identified they were thinking about their race and HIV status when they answered these questions. The limitation for me with this is, I really like this approach, but the limitation for me is it could be very different for different experiences. It's like in one of these experiences that they laid out, it might be that it was really, I was thinking about myself as a Black man because I conceal my HIV status. But then in another experience, like with friends or whatever, or family, whatever, I was really thinking about myself as a person living with HIV. And then in other experiences, like, at the clinic where I go, I might have been thinking of myself as a Black man living with HIV. So I might have been thinking about myself differently. It's not like, especially given that instruction set where it's like, think about these experiences based on all these attributions of yourself, where sometimes it might be my religion, and sometimes, and then at the end, you have to sort of say, well, I think I was mostly thinking about, so it's a bit of imprecision here, but I like the idea. So stigma attributions can be made at the item level, like we just saw, but at the item level. And this is where we wanted to go. So we looked at different stigma experiences with people who have had the experiences, attributing them to different dimensions of themselves. But the question became, how do we formulate a scale? What is the measurement, the approach, the strategy to get a score? So a research assistant that we have, who kind of does some data work for us, who's a smart guy. He knows he's a smart guy. And so he was a science major, and he actually studied geology. And so I was having this conversation with a couple of people and him, and he said, oh, you could just use geometry. So Bruno Schemke, who you've never heard of, said, why not take the concept of intersectionality literally as axes, lines that intersect, dimensions that intersect? And I said, I don't understand. I don't know what you mean. So in a classic Jeff and Bill Fisher sense, he took out a napkin. Some of you may know that Jeff and Bill Fisher formulated their IMB model on a paper plate at a retreat. And Jeff Fisher has this paper plate hanging in his office. Bruno Schemke took out a napkin and started drawing on a napkin to me what he was talking about. And he was talking about literally intersecting lines in geometry. So let's say we want to, whoops, I skipped this. Let's say we want to assess HIV stigma with an item like, have you been unfairly excluded from social situations because you are HIV positive? That's a typical HIV stigma item. We could just ask, take the HIV out of it and just ask, have you been unfairly excluded from social situations? And then if the individual says, yes, I have, then we ask them, well, how much of this was because you're HIV positive? And where that takes us then is to a unidimensional scale that we all use a lot in measuring HIV stigma, where we say, but how much do you believe you are unfairly excluded from social situations because, and if you say yes, because HIV, I'm HIV positive, that would be the HIV stigma. But we can also ask, well, if you've been unfairly excluded from social situations, has it been because of some other stigmatized attribute, like race or gender or sexual orientation, and have the person rate that too? So now we have these two unidimensional dimensions, but I view them as orthogonal. I view them as two independent dimensions where they might intersect in a person's experiences and a person's self and a person's identity, but they can be measured independently, which makes them orthogonal. And if they're orthogonal, then they would intersect at their origin at scores of 0 both. But if the scores of 0 are not both, or both of them, I should actually say, both of them are non-zero, there's another line that they intersect at. And that's actually the hypotenuse of a right triangle. So assuming that HIV and the other attribute are orthogonal, that's an assumption that is arguable. You could say, well, yeah, but they're not necessarily orthogonal. That's true. It's an assumption of this approach. They can be thought to intersect at their origin, where they both have scores of 0, and at other points along those two dimensions. And then we have a mathematical formula for getting a scale. And so that's, you recognize that if you had geometry, which I did in high school. as the Pythagorean theorem. And so we can take their A score and their B score and create a C score. So for example, consider a woman who has experienced being excluded from social situations. She may then attribute the experience to her race, let's say with a score of 9, and to a lesser degree, her HIV status. The intersectional race HIV stigma score will be 10.3 on that scale. So it's 9 squared plus 5 squared, take the square root, which is a higher score than our 0 to 10 scale. That's easily remedied because the intersectional score actually can range from 0 to 14.1, but we just standardize them. So we put them back on the 0 to 100 scale just by simply standardizing the scale, which is very simple to do. And that's how we get our intersectional stigma score. Now, another very nice thing about this geometric approach is that you're not limited to 2 dimensions, okay? Because the Pythagorean theorem extends to 3 and 4 dimensions. And I don't think we ever need to go beyond 4 dimensions. And so, although I guess in some hypergeometry you probably could, this is not about that. And so in 3 dimensions, which we do because we're interested in race, gender, HIV intersectional stigma, or race, sexual orientation, HIV intersectional stigma. Those are things I'm very interested in. We can get a 3-dimensional intersectional score. We do. So conceptually, how does this assessment work? Well, it works this way. Stigma mechanisms are internalized, anticipated, and enacted. We can ask people if they've been treated poorly, and we can ask people if they think in the future they're going to be treated poorly, and we can ask people if they deserve to be treated poorly. So we can assess enacted, anticipated, and internalized stigma. With an affirmative response to those questions, we can ask people to rate. Why? Is it because you're Black, because you're a man who has sex with men, because you have HIV? And you can say a lot or a little or none or all to all of them. And so our actual approach was to, in REDCap, to program using routine skip patterns, the program. So someone would be asked, this is really our measure. It is common for people to have negative experiences in their community, a broad opening. Please tell us how often you have experienced each and why you believe it happened. So I have been unfairly excluded from social situations. That's an enacted stigma item. And if someone says never, they go on to the next one. If someone says rarely or occasionally or often, then we ask them, they see the next screen, which is, okay, how much do you think you've been treated unfairly, you've been unfairly excluded from social situations because I'm HIV positive, I'm Black, I'm a woman, or some other reason. And so some other reason gives them, there are a lot of reasons why someone might be excluded from, in addition to these 3. And there are interesting things that we can do with that score that we haven't really started to do yet, which is subtract it from all the, add them all together and take a proportion, for example. If for some other reason it encompasses everything, then you could take a proportion as a score. So what percent of their negative experiences are attributable to their race relative to their HIV status, relative to something else? So it's kind of an important feature, I think, to have this other things that we are not specifically asking about dimension. That's the approach. Well, I have some data that I can show you. I don't know if it's a good time to stop and take questions. Won't take long. Let me go ahead and finish the data, and then I'd be very interested to hear what people think, and I don't know if I can answer questions. I'll try. So in a test of concept, now in full disclosure, which I don't think I'm required to fully disclose this, But I should go ahead and tell you that we collected data from like 500 Black men who have sex with men who are HIV negative, and like 450. We collected data from about 150, 200 HIV positive men. But those data are being analyzed, and I can't really talk about them. And some things are not so crystal clear with the negative men. But the HIV stigma, so like the HIV negative men, we said because you're Black, because you're a man who has sex with men, because the third dimension, well, I don't need to get into it. For some of those men, for half of them, they also responded to a third option, which is an intersectional item. We asked them, because you're Black, because you're a man who has sex, because you have sex with men, and then the third option was because you're a Black man who has sex with men. And so it's a real sort of internal test for us on whether or not our geometric score looks like the intersectional item. I can't talk about that right now. We don't really know. And frankly, it's not as exciting to me about what we're seeing with how different attributes of the self intersect with someone's HIV status attribute. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So in a sample of about 100 women, 98 women living with HIV, they're all African-American living with HIV down in Georgia. They responded to online ads and announcements at local clinics. And they called us. All of these activities are done on the phone. They called us. They were visually screened. So we have like this video chat protocol where people have to show a photo ID of who they are and some proof of their HIV status, could most typically an antiretroviral bottle. So we can confirm that these people are in fact 18 and over and HIV positive. And then their gender is self-reported, and their race. So if someone says, yeah, I'm Black and I'm a woman, and here's my proof that I'm HIV positive, and here's my proof that I'm 18 or over, that's who's in these data. And they were on average 37 years old. You can see that they're representative of our samples in Atlanta. They're pretty low income. And they've been living with HIV for quite some time. And they report 84% undetectable viral loads. That's a sort of description. And what we did was we gave them a way too long assessment. So the measures were long. This is a long battery. We asked too much of people. And we're very grateful for the people that completed the assessments. But we had them respond to 24 different enacted stigma items. And they fell along, discrimination experiences, interpersonal stigma, and felt stigma. And so these are some of the items. This is sort of standard stuff. We didn't do a bunch of focus groups and stuff to identify and write items. We took items from other scales and from scales that we've used in the past, and from Valerie's scales, and from the everyday discrimination scale. And we adapted them for this. We didn't feel a need to invent more stigma questions. And so we had a very broad representation of stigma experiences. And you can see that for these discrimination experiences, they're common, people report having them, but a lot of people say they never had this experience or these experiences, which means they didn't provide the attribution. And these are what the interpersonal stigma items look like. They're just very typical. You've seen them before because we didn't write new items for the most part. And these are the felt stigma items. So you can see that people feel stigma more than they experience interpersonal, and they experience more interpersonal than they experience discrimination. This is all well known. Now, what you have to get, though, is that we get a lot of scores, right? So we can score these 24 enacted stigma items, irregardless of their attribution. We have a experience of discrimination and stereotyping and prejudice stigma scale. And so we can look at what that looks like. And that's our like enacted stigma scale. So you can see that enacted stigma correlates with the everyday discrimination scale. It should. It correlates, but not hugely, with internalized stigma, which is good because we want it to be different. We have a scale that measures stigma avoidance. Do you like take the labels off your medications? Do you not go to the clinic during busy hours? Things like that to avoid people knowing that you're HIV positive. We have a HIV status disclosure self-efficacy scale that we've used for a long time, and it correlates negatively with that, as it should. Stigma experiences correlate with depression, and our measure does. So it seems to be functioning as a enacted stigma scale like we would hope it would as a measure of enacted stigma. But that's not really what we're doing here. What we're really doing here is looking at those attributions. So this is what the attributions look like. You can see that the attributions are race, gender, and HIV and other reasons. These are on 100-point scales. And then you can see the intersectional scores of the race, gender, race, HIV, gender, HIV, and the race, gender, HIV, all three dimensions, intersectional stigma scores. And you can see that just sort of distributionally, they're similar. They're like the individual dimensions, the unidimensional scales, which we view as maybe good because it's not like there's some mathematical weirdness that inflates the intersectional score. And what you see down below is actually the paired t-tests for those for the intersectional score. Well, the first three are paired t-tests between the unidimensional scores, and the other t-tests are for the intersectional scores when there is with the independent non-included dimension. So we can look at we can look at race, gender, race rather, versus the gender HIV intersection, but we can't look at gender versus gender HIV because that's statistically redundant. It's actually a limitation of this approach, because if we want to do like a multivariate analysis, we'd have to do something statistically fancy, like look at residual scores or something, because the intersectional scores are not independent with the unidimensional, and they're not independent of each other when they overlap. We did the same thing with anticipated stigma, but we rather than we made, I think, a mistake. We put the anticipated stigma on a slide bar scale. We got a little carried away, I think, with slide bars, and so. But anyway, we would do a Likert type scale in the future, which we will. But nevertheless, we have these ratings of how likely it is that you believe you will experience these things in the future. And lots of people say, oh, no, I don't expect that to happen. And so there are 0 scores, which is fine. And then a real range, because these scales were also from 0 to 100. And we did the same thing for discrimination. We used the same items. We just reframed them, right? We used the same items. There are 20 of these. We excluded 4 items that didn't make sense for future attribution. So we used 20 of the enacted items, but reframed for how likely do you think this will happen to you in the future, for the same things: discrimination, interpersonal, and felt. These are the correlations between the anticipated stigma scale without the attribution, just how likely do you think these things are going to happen to you in the future, with the same correlates I showed you before. And so this is like really interesting, because this really does look like we did a good job measuring anticipated stigma, though, because you see things like stigma avoidance should be very high here. People who do more things to avoid people learning that they're HIV positive and trying to avoid stigma experiences, they should have a higher anticipatory stigma score, and they do, and it's not redundant. So all these correlations are in the ballpark of what we kind of would hope to see, because if they were too high, they could be redundant, and we would be disappointed if they were not correlated. So they actually, it looks like we're doing the items that we've constructed for the stems all work pretty well. And then for the attributional ratings, these again are not, the attributional ratings, interestingly and importantly, I think, kind of mirror the attributional ratings for the enacted stigma. Just looking at the means and the standard deviations distributionally, it's interestingly similar. The dependent t-tests are not different also, which is like what I was saying, I think that's not a bad thing. But interestingly, the gender versus race HIV intersection is statistically different. So you can see that the gender HIV intersection is significantly greater, or the race HIV intersection is, compared to gender, is significantly greater than the gender. So it's in these women. And so it's that kind of a difference that it could be an anomaly, but I don't think so. I think that there might be something going on, and it's the kind of thing we want to pursue with this scale. And then finally, I'd show you the correlation between the anticipated and enacted stigma scales and the sources of attribution. So this is what I was saying. It looks like the attributions to race, for example, for the enacted and the anticipated score, I said distributionally they look similar, but we can also correlate them. And in fact, they're very highly correlated. And the way that we did this gives me some confidence that in our measurement, actually, because there was a lot in this. There's a lot going on in this measure, in this survey. There was the 24. There was too much going on in this survey. There were the 24 enacted items. And then for each one someone said they had experience, they did these 4 attributional ratings. Then there were some buffers between, like we measured depression, we measured the things that you saw, social support, a bunch of stuff. And then they did the 20 anticipated, again, with the 4 attributes. So it was a lot here and a lot between the two. So it gives me some confidence that actually, at least how things are being rated, is some internal consistency to them. So that's what I would have to share today. My conclusions would be that a geometric approach to measuring intersectional stigma is feasible. We were able to do it. And it seems to show some promise in this test of concept, at least with respect to how HIV stigma intersects with other attributes. The scales yield separate measures of stigma experiences and the attributed reasons for those experiences. And these are not the same. So there's a lot of stuff going on in these measures. It's been part of the problem for me is being able, it's not like a simple analysis. It really requires a lot of thought on my part. Usually I just like, oh, let me look at that. But that's not like this. And so, I start to think about the importance of that other dimension, which people rated highly, and how that might be factored into this scale. Maybe we need to be looking at a residual. And so I don't know right now, but there's a lot going on. If you think about it, in that enacted stigma scale, we have really 3 enacted stigma scales, right? So we have discrimination, interpersonal, and felt. Each of those gets an enacted stigma score. Then each of those also gets attributed to gender, attributed to race, and attributed to HIV status. And those intersect, right? So that's like 3 more intersection. And then they all 3 intersect. So it's like there's like 12 scales for each of those subscales. It's 36 scores. It's too much. It's just too much. And so we're right now trying to figure out what's the most meaningful summary scores that we can actually focus on. So we've not even looked at the subscales. We're just saying enacted stigma and anticipated stigma. It generates a lot of data. Our next step is to refine the scales, make them, select the items. The goal is to select 9 or 10 enacted items. reframe them for anticipated, reframe them for internalized, and do this again. But we're also going to change the response set. The slide bars seem to be good. They give us a lot of range, but I'm not convinced that people actually understood them that well. And so we're looking at different response formats that REDCap allows. We may end up back at slide bars, but we're not sure. But the next step here that we're kind of in the middle of right now is to refine the scales. This was our first test of concept, and then do our validation study, which is the second half of our project. So we're probably going to collect those data this summer. So the key collaborators on this work are really Lisa Eaton, who's always like the driving fuel behind any idea I ever have. Although in this case, Bruno Schemke actually came up with this approach. And then we rely very much on Valerie Earnshaw's work and on her advice. Proudly, she was the first student in our HIV T32 here at UConn. Actually, Lisa was the first student. Valerie was in the next, in the same year, in the same cohort. But you know, Valerie and Lisa, I mean, I'm really talking about a pretty high proportion of the variance in quality stigma work out there when you talk about Eaton and Earnshaw. And then there's a whole bunch of other people that work with me. You know, this is funded by NIMH and an R21 that was in the PRISM RFA. And that is actually the grant number, which I just love so much. It's 12, 13, 14. And anyway, there's a whole bunch of people that obviously collect these data and contribute to this work. So that's a talk. So now we should talk about the talk.
Seth, thank you so much. This is fascinating work. I'm a little puzzled in terms of what does this all mean, and I think you will definitely get questions about that. But I really appreciated that you will give us the opportunity, that you gave us the opportunity to see how you are working with this and how your ideas have been evolving. That's really wonderful. So thank you so much. I think Stephen will take over to manage the questions.
Yep. Thanks, Theo. First, we have a few questions from Kathy Sycamore. Kathy says, Seth, so sorry this is not in person, and fantastic, Bruno. Assume you can combine or separate scores on internal, anticipated, and enacted in the geometric approach is the first question. And then more complex questions. First, seems quite cognitive and experiential attributed in stigma, understandably. Do you think it assesses social and systemic influences on racism? And then what might this imply for interventions? Must they be more individually tailored or integrated overall, or can they be more structural?
Yeah. So repeat the first question again.
Sure. I assume you can combine or separate scores on internal, anticipated, and enacted in the geometric approach.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I've not thought of doing that. So, wow. Yes, the answer is I think you could. I don't know what it would mean, but it sounds interesting to me now, doesn't it? So if someone has, you could take their, I could pull up SPSS, we could do it right now. You could take their gender attributional enacted score on an item and calculate a gender anticipate. I don't know. I think you could do it because they're all on the same metric and they're all conceptually the same. But I think it would be it would be a different thing, which is interesting. I just don't really know what it would be. But how, when, that's like deeply personology, because it's saying how do people's experiences of internalized and anticipated stigma intersect? And that is a very good question. I think how they intersect with enacted is too, but how someone internalizes stigma and what that means for their anticipating others to stigmatize them is pretty deep doo-doo. And I think it actually is very interesting. The measurement, there's no question the measurement lends itself to that kind of scoring. I have not thought about what that would mean.
Let me just add, Seth, Stephen said I could jump in. I had the thought before you presented the data. So you may have even expanded on it more than I was thinking. But so I just was wondering about being able to separate those out. So it was helpful then to see what data you do have.
Yeah, so they come to us separated out.
Yeah.
And we can score them just as the 3 dimensions as we would score them. But they don't intersect. They could, like I said, in one of our development studies, we did ask men to rate because I'm Black, because I'm a man, because I have sex with men. And then a third option was as if it's something different, because I'm a Black man who has sex with men. And those right now data are not looking pretty. And the reason why is because if I'm remembering this right, that intersectional item is are nearly identical to the because I have sex with men. So that when it's all and this was surprising because the stigma people say that race is a more salient part of identity in stigma studies than sexual orientation. But our intersectional rating, because I'm a Black man who has sex with men, looks nearly identical to their because I'm a man who has sex with men. And that might be because of the saliency of race. It might be like, look, I never separate out the fact that I'm Black. And this is sort of an issue for me with this whole, not measurement approach of ours, but the whole field of intersectionality, is that we're trying, we have a garden here where my wife is growing tulips. And I can go out to that garden and appreciate the beauty of the tulip. But once I start picking the petals off, I no longer have a tulip. So by, this whole deconstructing, dissecting the aspects of how an individual experiences themselves, we may be left with a bunch of psychometric scales that don't really represent people's phenomenological reality. And that's always the tension. It's like, does the Beck Depression Inventory really capture the phenomenology of clinical depression? I think the answer is no. But it's a good measure. It's a good approximation. It's a proxy. It's a model. A lot of different words. We don't say it is the thing. We say it is a reasonable metric of the thing. And that's kind of where I'm going here. I don't expect to reconceptualize intersectionality as a geometric thing. I'm just trying to think about how we can measure it.
Stephen, I can simplify those other 2 questions so other questions can be asked. Seth, the questions were related to that actually, which is, it's an assessment of an individual experience, right? But stigma is, as you said, a social construct, and we want to have structural interventions that can get at all the angles. So it was more a question about that it's an individual level measure, of course, but that we want to inform broader social intervention. So it was just, I was curious. It doesn't have to be a you don't have to develop an intervention right now, but I just was thinking about what does it tell us about that and what does it mean for the future?
Right. So yeah, I totally get it. And here's sort of my response is it is what it is, which is an individual level assessment. I don't know. I think we're the only place in terms of interventions that it would lead is in a very, what I find to be dissatisfying approach, which is what a lot of HIV stigma researchers are doing, which is to develop coping interventions to help people better cope with stigma. I don't even think it takes us there. It might be an outcome measure in such interventions. It might be an outcome measure in structural interventions. But I don't know that this measurement approach changes things sort of conceptually in a theoretical way that would lead to even individual, much less structural interventions. But you could think about it, I keep coming back in my own thinking to like a measure of depression. It's not like the Beck Depression Inventory really takes us to a new psychotherapeutic approach. It's an outcome measure for Beck's cognitive psychotherapy for depression.
Thanks, Seth, and thanks, Kathy. Our next question comes from Teo. Seth, can you give a conceptual definition of what the intersectional scores are?
Yes. They are the point at which the individual, the unidimensional stigma scores meet. So it's not multiplicative, and it's not really additive. So conceptually, what the scores mean is they represent a independent, that's not truly independent, a new dimension that encompasses the two unidimensional scores, but it is a different score, and it's expected to correlate differently than any one of the two dimensions. So conceptually, it is a unique attribute that encompasses the unidimensional stigma attributes.
Thank you.
Two questions from Christina Rodriguez-Hart. First, if the combined scores were quite similar to the unidimensional scores, is there an added value from measuring the combinations when the survey is long?
Well, if we just stick with the women's data, the answer to that question is maybe, because we have to see if distributionally, it's nice that they're similar, but are they associated with things differently? And maybe more, associated meaning correlated with dimensional things, but also differentiated by individual things. So, for example, do women who conceal their HIV status, for example, do they differ on the intersectional scores differently than they would differ on the unidimensional scores from women who don't conceal their HIV status? And so it's those kinds of questions that we're gonna try to answer in the next study. We're also very interested in how these scales are related to things that stigma should predict, like adherence to antiretroviral therapy. And it might be that the intersectional score is a better predictor of non-adherence than HIV stigma alone, or race-related experiences, racism alone. And so that's the hypothesis. I don't know though. If the answer is no, then the approach isn't worth pursuing.
Great. And our next question was, you mentioned earlier that stigma experiences have varying salience in different situations. How can you get at salience?
Yeah, so how can you get it? How can you get it like the saliency?
Yes.
Yeah, so actually we may or may not do that. I'm not sure. If I had a student interested in one of these social psychology students who's interested in stigma, working on it with me, which I may, but this hasn't come up. But it's the kind of question that that gets more deeply into stigma theory, which I'm not uninterested in. But I don't know where it would take me. But my point is that there are ways to measure that saliency that the social psychologists have devised, where you ask people to sort of conceptualize themselves and then rate what is most important in their personal experiences, things like that. There are measures of identity saliency. And that may, if I can find a measure that's not going to occupy a lot of space and time, I could see including it in our validation study, because that should inform our ratings. People who say that their race is more salient than their sexual orientation should be attributing their stigma experiences more. It might help us understand sort of the functioning of these ratings. But it is measurable. Saliency is measurable, and we may end up measuring it in the validation study.
Great, thanks, Ed. And then a question from Brian Kuttner. Brian says, this is a very helpful talk, Seth. Thanks for sharing what you've learned. There's a tension between our pre-selection of the most salient stigmatized attributes to measure, and on the other hand, giving more room for respondents to select their own salient attributes themselves. For example, immigration status, poverty, targeting by police, etc., might be more salient than HIV and gender for some of your respondents. So the question is, what's your sense of our ability to try to measure the most salient stigma attributes using the quadratic formula approach you've used? It seems like we're in the early stages of being able to capture the construct.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. So we are a priori pre-selecting your attributes. You know, I can imagine, was Jackson, one of the studies I showed you, where they had people, answer all these stigma questions and then say, okay, so what aspects of yourself were you thinking of when you answered these questions? You can actually do that on the front end and say, there's 20 characteristics that any person may identify as a part of themselves. Check the 4 that most represent how you see the most important aspects of yourself. And then based on those responses, the assessment, you could do this in REDCap, what 4 attributes they see will be those things. I could definitely see doing that. The problem I have with it is that it's not a problem. It may be relevant to a certain line of research, et cetera, where you're interested in intersectionality. I'm not really interested in intersectionality. I'm interested in intersectional HIV stigma. I'm actually really interested in HIV stigma. And it was actually an issue for me writing this grant, because the grant is not about people with HIV. It's about Black men who have sex with men and PrEP. And so writing the grant, I had to sort of pivot to the RFA, but what data am I talking to you about today? So it's sort of driven, my interest here. But if a person said, look, I don't really identify myself as a person living with HIV, that's a medical condition I have and I kind of deal with it, and I don't tell anybody about it. So it's not a part of my experience. It's not anyone's business. Geez, why are we asking about HIV stigma as an attribute to rate all these experiences on? And so the value in what I think you're suggesting is clear, but I don't know what, other than a global intersectional stigma score, it would mean something different for each person. And this is the tension in psychometric assessment between how can we get a reliable and valid score that embodies the intrapersonal phenomenological experience. Well, maybe we can't. Well, then let's just get the intrapersonal phenomenological experience, which I can see the value in, but it's not a measurement strategy. And so it's really this tension that I think is often true, but not talked about as much. It's like when I developed the sexual sensation seeking scale, which people still use. Someone actually asked me if they could translate it to Italian for the dissertation this week. Kathy will recall the Seth's sexual sensation seeking scale. And it was never a conversation. We never talked about, yeah, but does that really represent sort of the adventurism? I mean, even David Ostrow, who's very interested in the sexual adventurism that he measured in the MAX, even he wasn't saying, yeah, but does it really sort of capture the phenomenological experience on a day-to-day basis and the feelings that people have about their sexual escapades? No one talked like that. It was like, oh, wow, that correlates with condom use, And so stigma is such a personal, really intrapersonal attribute that it's different. We're having a lot of conversations about representation of the experience about in relation to the scale that I don't think we have with a lot of other scales, but we might have with clinical scales like depression and anxiety. And that's a tension area. I remember when I was a graduate student, the great Charles Spielberger, who did the state trait anxiety inventory. The state trait anxiety inventory always highly correlates with measures of depression, like at least 6.6.7. And someone asked him at a Society for Personality Assessment conference that I was at as a graduate student, someone asked him this question. They said, if you can't get a differentiated anxiety score from a depression score, aren't you just really measuring personal distress and they're all the same? And his response was Spielberger, Charles Spielberger, in his response in the Southern drawl, he said, well, you know, when people are depressed, they know they're depressed. When people are anxious, they know they're anxious. Those are different things. We're just striving to measure them. And we know that they overlap, that depressed people are anxious and anxious people get depressed. But we're striving to have these measures, and they're going to correlate. So I know that when we're measuring clinical phenomenon, people have these conversations about the phenomenology and the scale's representation of it. That's different, though, than the kinds of measures we've typically used in public health. So it says to me that stigma is really closely related in our thinking to more clinical type things than risk behavior or adherence predictor things. So I think it's interesting.
Thanks, Seth. A question from Millicent Freeman. Millicent asks, have you measured the lived experiences of the person's rural versus urban experiences and the influences of faith or religious upbringing? We know that place influences our internalized and anticipated feelings. What can we do next? How do we use this information to empower the most vulnerable?
It's really interesting. So we do our work in Atlanta, but that's not true anymore. We've really, for the past decade, our work is in Georgia. So we have a home base in Atlanta, but we also have a home base in Macon, Georgia, which is about an hour and a half or something south of Atlanta. We have a partner there, Harold Kantner. He's a wonderful infectious disease doc at Mercer University, and we're connected to the health clinic, the HIV clinic in that district for like the past decade. That's where we've been doing our alcohol work. So we've published papers around the stigma experiences of people in Atlanta versus Macon, and definitely there is a geography, not geometry, but a geographical reality to stigma. And we think it's probably related to social support and being a part of a community and things like that. But definitely people in rural areas experience stigma differently. And we have not looked at these scales on an urban-rural dimension, but we could. We recruited statewide, and we could easily differentiate people who were in different places. So, we can look at this scale that way. I don't think that's what you were asking, though, which is more like the urban and rural experience. And could that, I don't know if you were asking this specifically, but the question I kind of am thinking right now is, could we have, is being a city person versus a rural person an identity? Is it an attribute? So could you say, I experience this because I live in a rural area. I experience this because I have HIV. I experience this because I'm Black. And you could look at the intersections. I think you could, as long as people identify as being someone who lives in a rural area. I mean, they may be a city person who's spending all their time in rural areas because of circumstances, like a New Yorker who's hanging out in the Catskills. this would be a challenge. Is that really who you are? And so, but that's a saliency question. And so if you screen on these are who you are, it's like we screen on gender and sexual orientation and HIV status. We could say, you know, do you identify yourself as being a city person or a suburb or a rural person? We could look at that. I think it might not be unimportant. I think you're right. I know you're right about the urban-rural experience of stigma. I don't know how it might impact intersection, and that's interesting.
Thanks, Seth. A question from Lorraine Aflito. This was a wonderful talk. Your questions are valid and your probes are accurately pointed to evaluate intersectional stigma. You can answer your questions by changing method of data analysis. Have you tried using a mixed effects method with an interaction using Gamel-J and Jamovi? An identity fusion scale is a streamlined way to measure identity salience. It uses Venn diagrams. And Lorraine, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to explain that further.
I'm sorry, is there going to be more explanation, or I can try to answer?
Yeah, if you can try to answer. It looks like she's no longer on the call.
Oh, wow. What a lousy question. No, I'm just kidding. She's no longer on the call. That was a joke, right? No, yeah, so that what I was saying before is I know that there are ways to measure saliency. And I know that I've seen these Venn diagram kinds of things. And I'll be looking at them for our validation study. I don't think it's unimportant in terms of trying to understand how this metric is working. So I guess the answer to the question is I agree, and we'll be looking into it.
Thanks, Seth. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. If anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, Teo, the floor is yours.
Susan Tross has a question.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, Seth, thank you so much for a very provocative talk. I'm kind of cooking it, so I don't have anything coherent to say.
Well, it's very nice to see you.
You too.
I think that applies to a lot of us. Christina.
I have a question. Yeah. So Seth, we're focusing a lot on stigma within healthcare and CBO settings, and more on the perpetrator of stigma, which has largely gone ignored in the measurement world, except for, of course, like Laura Nibley, HVP's scale. And so do you have recommendations in terms of taking what we know from measuring in terms of perpetration of stigma and trying to do it in an intersectional way?
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it. So can you take, because I'm familiar with some of that work, you know, this is so self-indulgent, but I think that Jeff Kelly, my mentor's first study was actually a stigma study of medical students at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, and their negative I think it's before anyone was talking about stigma. It was like, 1964 or something. I don't know. No, it was, seriously, like 1985 or something. I think his first study in this area was negative attitudes of medical students towards people with HIV. So I'm familiar with this work. It's interesting. I haven't thought about, though, what you'd be trying to get at would be, how do providers hold negative attitudes towards HIV? And how do they hold racist attitudes? And do those things intersect? So do they treat Black people with HIV differently than they treat white people with HIV? That would be racism. Do they treat Black people with HIV differently than they treat Black people who don't have HIV. That would be HIV stigma. And so how they intersect, I haven't given this any thought at all. I'm not sure how you'd ask people these questions is my immediate reaction to your question. I think it's interesting as hell, but I don't know because it's easy to get a person to talk about, well, it's not easy for them. Sometimes it's painful, but we know how to ask people about their negative experiences. We are not as good at asking people in a psychometric way about their negative beliefs towards others because of social desirability. But sometimes you'll be surprised what people will tell you, and how forthright they might be because they think there's nothing wrong with the way that they think. So I wouldn't say it can't be done. I would say it would be very interesting to try to do it. Where it starts is with measures of those things, like providers' attitudes towards people based on race, providers' attitudes towards people based on HIV. Look for items that might work for both, and then see if you can take the race and the HIV out of them and ask those things separately.
Seth, are we assuming that all the providers are white?
Not in Georgia.
So that complicates
but that doesn't mean that they don't hold racist attitudes towards Black people with HIV.
I hear you. Okay, this was a wonderful session, Seth. It's really thought-provoking, and as Susan said, it will take some time to process this. So fortunately, this session is recorded. It will be available on the HIP Center website under the Grand Rounds.